In June of 941, near the northern entrance to the Bosporus, a small group of Byzantine ships moved toward one of the largest fleets ever reported on the Black Sea. The attackers were the Rus, a Viking-led power centered on Kiev. One near-contemporary account placed their fleet at roughly 1,000 vessels. The Byzantines may have had only 15 ships ready to meet them. For the Rus, the opportunity seemed almost too good to be true. Constantinople, the richest city in the region, stood behind the imperial squadron. The main Byzantine navy was away fighting in the Mediterranean, while the empire's strongest field army was hundreds of miles to the east. If these last ships could be captured, the approaches to the capital would lie open. The Rus boats moved in to surround them. Warriors prepared to board with axes, swords, spears, and shields. The Byzantine vessels were old, heavily outnumbered, and apparently trapped, yet their commander, a man named Theophanes, did not retreat. He waited as the space between the fleets disappeared. For the men in the approaching boats, this was the final obstacle after a journey of roughly 1,000 miles by river and sea. They had brought their vessels down rivers, hauled them around rapids, crossed waters exposed to sudden storms, and arrived at the imperial capital while its defenders were scattered across distant fronts. Now the last Byzantine ships seemed to be offering themselves for capture. If the Rus broke through, there was no comparable squadron waiting immediately behind them. If Theophanes failed, the fighting could reach the harbours and coastal districts of Constantinople before the emperor's main forces returned. Then bronze tubes mounted aboard the Byzantine ships turned toward the surrounding boats. Fire erupted across the water. It struck sails, rigging, timber, clothing, and men. Boats crowded together collided as crews tried to escape. Some Rus warriors jumped into the sea rather than remain aboard the burning vessels. Others, weighed down by helmets and armor, disappeared beneath the surface. The weapon would become known to history as Greek fire. But the flames alone did not end the invasion. Much of the Rus force escaped, reached the Asian shore, and began a campaign of destruction that continued for months. What appeared to be a sudden Byzantine victory became a longer and more dangerous struggle. The flames explain how Constantinople survived the first attack. They do not explain why the Rus believed the city was vulnerable, why they continued after their plan collapsed, or how a nearly defenseless empire found enough time to turn one desperate defense into a devastating counterattack. The crisis had begun before the Rus fleet appeared on the horizon. Sometime in late spring or early summer, warning reached Emperor Romanos I Lekapenos that a large hostile force was crossing the Black Sea. The precise route by which the news arrived is uncertain. Some traditions connect it to Byzantine Cherson in Crimea. Others suggest that information passed through Bulgarian territory. Whatever the source, the message carried an alarming truth. The Rus were approaching at exactly the moment when Constantinople's mobile defences were weakest. The Byzantine Empire was fighting on several fronts. Its operational navy was engaged against Arab forces in the Mediterranean. John Kourkouas, the empire's senior field commander, was campaigning in the east with many of its best troops. Romanos still possessed the great walls of Constantinople, local garrisons, palace guards, and the manpower of an enormous city. What he lacked was a fleet capable of meeting the Rus before they reached the capital. That mattered because Constantinople's walls did not protect everything around them. The city stood on a peninsula between the Golden Horn, the Bosporus, and the Sea of Marmara, but its economy and security depended on shipping, harbours, coastal communities, estates, and settlements beyond the strongest fortifications. The Rus did not need to breach the Theodosian walls to create a political catastrophe. They could burn suburbs, destroy ships, seize captives, and expose the government's inability to protect the center of the empire. Romanos could send orders recalling his forces, but orders could not bring ships across the Mediterranean overnight. Nor could Corquus abandon the eastern frontier and instantly appear outside Constantinople. The emperor needed to keep the Rus away from the city long enough for the empire's greater resources to matter. The danger was political as well as military. Romanos had not inherited undisputed authority. He had risen from relatively modest origins through the navy, attached himself to the imperial government, and eventually placed himself above the legitimate Macedonian emperor Constantine VII. By 941, he ruled as senior emperor, but protecting the capital was the most basic test of that authority. A hostile fleet burning the approaches to Constantinople would destroy more than property. It would expose weakness at the center of a government Romanos had worked relentlessly to control. The emperor also had to resist the temptation to scatter his remaining strength. Sending every available soldier along the coastline might protect individual communities for a few hours, but it would weaken the capital and still leave the defenders unable to predict where the Rus would land. Romanos therefore concentrated on the point the attackers had to pass if they intended to approach Constantinople by water. He could not defend the entire coast. He could try to deny them the decisive target long enough for the rest of the empire to respond. He ordered a search for every vessel still available in the capital. The result was hardly reassuring. According to the later Byzantine tradition, officials found only about 15 old, retired, or otherwise usable ships. They may have included vessels no longer considered suitable for frontline service. Against a fleet said to number in the hundreds or more, they could accomplish little in conventional combat. Romanos, however, had risen through the Byzantine navy before taking the throne. He understood ships and the limitations of maritime warfare. He did not intend to send the old vessels into an ordinary battle of ramming, missiles, and boarding. Instead, he ordered them fitted with devices capable of projecting the empire's most feared incendiary weapon. The Byzantines did not call it Greek fire. Their sources referred to liquid fire, prepared fire, Roman fire, or sea fire. Its exact formula has been lost, despite centuries of speculation. A petroleum-based substance such as naphtha was probably central, perhaps combined with resin or other materials that helped it burn and adhere. Claims that its composition is known with certainty, or that water itself always caused it to ignite, go beyond the evidence. The delivery system is less mysterious. A prepared liquid could be heated or pressurized inside a protected container and forced through metal tubing toward a nozzle mounted aboard a ship. An ignition source near the outlet transformed the stream into a projected sheet of flame. In effect, the Byzantine vessel carried a short-range naval flamethrower. It was powerful, but it was not magic. Its crews needed training. The firing ship had to approach within useful range. Wind and sea conditions mattered, as did the direction of the target. The mechanism could not cover every side of a vessel at once, and a ship carrying combustible liquid faced dangers of its own. If Rus warriors boarded before the siphon crews could act, the weapon might never be used effectively. Preparing the ships involved far more than mounting a tube on a deck. Pumps, containers, piping, and ignition equipment had to work together. Men had to protect the operators, while sailors kept the firing side of the vessel pointed toward a moving target. Archers and other missile troops could disrupt an approaching crew, but they could not hold back hundreds of boats indefinitely. The fire had to break the Rus formation before boarding began. Romanos reportedly ordered the old ships equipped to project fire both forward and astern. If that detail is correct, it suggests that he anticipated exactly what numerical inferiority would produce. Rus boats would try to come around the Byzantine vessels rather than remain only in front of them. Firing in more than one direction gave Theophanes a chance to punish an encirclement, turning the enemy's natural response to 15 isolated ships into the condition the weapon required. Romanos entrusted the emergency squadron to Theophanes, an officer about whom the surviving sources reveal frustratingly little. What is known is enough to define the responsibility placed upon him. He had to take a handful of old ships against a fleet so large that a conventional engagement offered no realistic hope of victory. He had to bring those ships close to the enemy and then prevent the enemy from closing too far. Above all, he had to make the first discharge count. Once the Rus understood what the vessels carried, surprise would be gone. As Romanos prepared his desperate defense, the Rus continued south toward the city. Their arrival was the final stage of an expedition that had begun far from the Black Sea. The political center of the Rus world lay at Kiev on the middle Dnieper. It was not a centralized national state in the modern sense. Its ruler governed through a network of armed retainers, regional centers, tribute-paying communities, merchants and alliances. Scandinavian influence remained strong in the ruling and military elite, but the society developing around Kiev included Slavic and other peoples of Eastern Europe. That distinction matters when the attackers of 941 are described as Vikings. Igor of Kiev bore a name derived from the Old Norse Ingvar, and many members of the Rus elite, recorded in later diplomatic documents, also carried Scandinavian names. Yet Igor's expedition was not necessarily composed entirely of men from Scandinavia. It was more accurately a Viking-led Rus coalition drawing ships, supplies and manpower from the wider territories under his authority. The river system was the foundation of their power. From the forests and settlements of the north, goods moved toward Kiev and then south along the Dnieper. Furs, wax, honey and enslaved captives could be carried toward Byzantine markets. Silver, wine, luxury goods, and manufactured products traveled in the other direction. Whoever controlled the route could collect tribute and profit from trade linking northern Europe with the Black Sea and the Mediterranean world. At the southern end stood Constantinople, known in the Norse world as Miklagarth, the great city. It was a market of extraordinary wealth, but access to it depended on political agreements. Rus merchants could receive food, lodging, trading opportunities, and favorable treatment when relations were good. When those arrangements broke down or became less profitable, the same route that carried merchants could carry an army. Violence and commerce were not separate systems. A successful raid might compel the emperor to pay tribute or renew privileges. A treaty could then turn former attackers into regulated visitors and sometimes military partners. Earlier Rus forces had appeared before Constantinople in 860. The Rus tradition also credited Igor's predecessor Oleg with a great expedition and an advantageous agreement early in the 10th century, though several details of that story are legendary. No surviving source tells us exactly why Igor chose war in 941. Commercial pressure probably played a role. So did the wealth available in Byzantine territory and the need to reward the armed, following on which his authority depended. A controversial Khazar document connects the expedition to wider tensions involving Byzantium and the Khazars, and names a Rus leader called Helgu or Oleg rather than Igor. Historians continue to debate that account. The most widely accepted reconstruction still places Igor at the head of the campaign, while recognizing that the precise political trigger remains uncertain. One fact would have strengthened every argument for an attack. Byzantium appeared vulnerable. The main imperial fleet was occupied elsewhere, and the Eastern army was away from the capital. Whether the Rus learned this from merchants, envoys, allies, or scouts is unknown. Their timing suggests that they possessed information worth acting upon. Preparing the expedition required more than calling warriors to assemble. The Rus had to build or obtain a fleet deep inside the continent and carry it through one of the most difficult military routes in Europe. Constantine VII, a Byzantine emperor writing shortly after these events, described how Rus vessels were prepared for the annual journey toward Constantinople. During winter, Slavic tributary communities cut and shaped large dugout-like hulls. When spring melted the ice, the unfinished boats traveled through lakes and tributaries into the Dnieper. Vessels from regions associated with Novgorod, Smolensk, Chernigov, and other centers gathered at Kiev. Rus crews acquired the new hulls and transferred equipment from older boats. They installed oars, rowlocks, masts, sails, and steering gear. Weapons, tools, provisions, water containers, and repair materials had to be distributed. The fleet described in the sources was therefore not 1,000 identical Scandinavian longships. It consisted of river and sea-going craft of varying sizes, adapted for a journey that demanded both rowing and sailing. The numbers remain among the campaign's greatest uncertainties. The Russian Primary Chronicle gives 10,000 vessels, while some Byzantine versions offer totals as high as 15,000. Those figures are almost certainly exaggerated. Liutprand of Cremona, whose stepfather reportedly witnessed the attack while serving as an envoy in Constantinople, wrote of roughly 1,000 boats. Even that may be a rounded number, but historians generally consider it more credible than the enormous totals in later chronicles. No dependable troop count survives. Multiplying a presumed number of men per boat produces estimates of 40,000 or more, but such calculations rest on assumptions about vessels that were neither identical nor used only for carrying warriors. The expedition may have numbered many thousands, possibly even tens of thousands, but precision is impossible. Its fighting strength was also uneven. Igor's closest retainers and the wealthiest warriors could possess mail shirts, helmets, well-made swords, and decorated weapons acquired through trade or service abroad. Many others would have relied on spears, axes, bows, large knives, and round wooden shields. Mail was expensive. The fact that Liutprand describes armored men sinking during the naval battle shows that some Rus wore substantial protection, not that every man in the fleet looked like a fully equipped Scandinavian household warrior. On land, these men could form a compact body around their shields and force an enemy to meet them at spear range. On water, the same equipment created different risks. A shield consumed space in a low, crowded boat. Armor that saved a warrior from an arrow or blade could kill him if he fell overboard. The Rus tactical system depended on reaching shore or an enemy deck, where personal weapons and cohesion mattered. The Byzantine plan was designed to destroy that transition before it could take place. The expedition's organization probably reflected the political structure of the Rus realm. Igor could lead the coalition, but individual boat groups may have remained under their own chiefs and retainers. Such a system could gather a formidable force without maintaining a permanent centralized army. It was well suited to movement along rivers and to raids in which groups separated to find supplies and plunder. It was less suited to controlling hundreds of boats once fire, smoke, collision, and conflicting attempts to escape broke visual contact between leaders and crews. Once assembled, the fleet moved down the Dnieper and encountered the 7 great rapids. Here the route that gave the Rus access to the Black Sea became a chain of bottlenecks. At some rapids, crews could guide their boats along the bank, using poles and testing the water for submerged rocks. At others, they had to unload cargo and take vessels out of the river. Men dragged or carried the hulls overland before relaunching them downstream. At the largest obstruction, Constantine described a portage extending for miles. The physical effort was only part of the danger. The Pechenegs controlled the neighboring steppe and knew where the Rus were most exposed. Men carrying boats or moving cargo could not maintain a strong battle formation. Guards had to watch the surrounding country while the rest of the crews worked. A sudden attack could trap the fleet with its vessels on land, its supplies scattered, and its manpower divided. This vulnerability made peace or cooperation with the Pechenegs strategically important. Some later retellings place Pecheneg contingents in Igor's army of 941, but their participation is much clearer in the account of his second mobilization 3 years later. Whether they came as allies or merely watched from the steppe, their ability to attack the river route shaped every Rus movement south. Igor's expedition cleared the rapids and reached the lower Dnieper. There the crews rested, repaired damage, and prepared the boats for the sea. Masts and sails were installed or reset, supplies redistributed, and the fleet brought together before entering the Black Sea. The usual route toward Constantinople followed the western coast, passing territory connected to Bulgaria. Coastal navigation offered places to shelter, repair, and obtain water, but it also lengthened the journey. Storms could scatter lightly built boats, while news of the approaching fleet might travel overland faster than the fleet itself. At sea, the fleet's size created problems even without an enemy nearby. Boats did not all sail at the same speed. A damaged mast, leaking hull, or missing oar could force neighboring crews to slow down if the expedition intended to remain together. Drinking water had to be replenished, food protected from moisture, and landing places chosen with enough space for large numbers. The farther south Igor traveled, the more his success depended on speed. Each pause allowed reports of the fleet to move toward Constantinople. Igor nevertheless continued toward the greatest target available. By the time the expedition reached the Bosporus, too much labor and political capital had been invested to return without profit. The fleet had crossed rivers, rapids, steppe frontiers, and the Black Sea. Ahead lay Constantinople, with its navy absent and only a few ships visible between the Rus and the city. The geography appeared to favor an attacker arriving before the fleet. The Bosporus was the narrow maritime corridor between the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. Once through it, the Rus could threaten shipping and settlements close to the capital. Yet the same narrowing waterway could prevent a huge fleet from using its full width. Boats approaching in successive groups might see only what happened immediately ahead, and those behind could continue rowing after the leading crews had already discovered the danger. The route toward the prize was also a funnel. Those ships now sailed out under Theophanes. The Rus commanders faced a choice. They could remain at a distance, disperse, search for another approach, or move in to overwhelm the tiny Byzantine squadron. Capturing the ships and their crews promised both immediate plunder and the removal of the last visible obstacle before the capital. The numerical disparity made close attack seem reasonable. Rus boats began advancing from several directions. Their low wooden hulls carried warriors prepared for boarding. Spears and missiles could threaten exposed men on the Byzantine decks, while enough boats pressing in at once might divide the defenders' attention. If the Rus reached the sides of the larger vessels, axes and grappling lines could turn the encounter into close combat. Theophanes allowed the distance to shrink. The surviving accounts do not reveal his signals or the exact arrangement of the squadron. They do, however, make the logic of his position clear. If he fired too early, the first Rus boats could turn away and warn the rest. If he waited until several vessels were already alongside, his operators might be struck down before they discharged the weapon. Theophanes needed the enemy to believe for a few moments longer that the Byzantine ships were prizes rather than traps. His own ships were vulnerable. Their projectors could not fire effectively in every direction at once, and their crews needed room to operate. If the Rus attacked too loosely, the first targets might burn while the rest escaped. If Theophanes waited too long, warriors could reach his decks before the siphons changed the battle. The sea conditions appear to have favored the Byzantines. The Rus continued closing, and their attempt to surround the squadron compressed more boats into a confined area. Numerical superiority began turning into congestion. Vessels approaching from behind restricted those in front. Oars required room, and every boat that turned across another's path could block several more. Then the Byzantine crews activated the siphons. Flames surged from the nozzles and struck the nearest boats. The leading Rus vessels carried everything an incendiary attack needed: dry timber, rope, sails, shields, clothing, and men packed close together. Fire reached beyond the first point of impact, as burning rigging fell, and damaged boats drifted toward their neighbors. The sight was unlike the ordinary incendiaries familiar to many medieval warriors. Fire pots, flaming arrows, and burning missiles followed a visible arc and offered at least a chance to evade the point where they landed. The Byzantine siphons projected flame forward in a directed stream. To men expecting to board an old ship, it could appear as though the vessel itself had begun breathing fire. The first boats attempted to turn, but those behind them were still advancing. Oars struck neighboring hulls or became entangled. Men tried to cut away burning material, smother flames, or push damaged boats aside. Others jumped into the sea. Commands that might have restored order on open water became almost impossible to carry through the smoke and congestion. A chief aboard one vessel could order his crew to reverse, while another boat continued forward across his stern. Men looking toward the flames could not necessarily see a clear route behind them, nor could the entire fleet respond to one command at once. The very number of Rus vessels ensured that danger would reach different parts of the formation before reliable information did. Fire also forced choices for which the crews had little preparation. Staying aboard a burning boat meant risking flames and suffocating smoke. Entering the water offered escape from the deck, but exposed a man to armor, currents, oars, and the movement of surrounding hulls. Climbing into another vessel saved him only by overcrowding the crew attempting to maneuver it. Every individual effort to survive added pressure to a fleet already losing its shape. Liutprand's account preserves the most vivid description. Some of the Rus, he wrote, preferred the water to the fire. Some sank beneath the weight of armor and helmets, while others burned aboard their ships. His language is dramatic and hostile, but the basic result is supported by the Byzantine tradition. Fire shattered the forward attack and drove the Rus away from the approaches to Constantinople. Theophanes pressed the advantage while confusion lasted. His squadron could threaten groups of boats that moments earlier had expected to surround it. The Rus formation broke apart as crews outside the worst congestion turned toward open water. Some men abandoned damaged craft and climbed into neighboring vessels. Others tried to reach the Asian shore, yet the popular image of 1,000 ships disappearing in a single burst of fire cannot be reconciled with the campaign that followed. The Byzantines had broken the attack, not annihilated the entire expedition. A substantial Rus force escaped the immediate battle and moved toward Bithynia, across the water from the imperial capital. Romanos had achieved his most urgent objective. The Rus were no longer advancing directly toward Constantinople, and his emergency squadron remained operational. But the empire now faced a different kind of threat. Thousands of armed raiders were reaching a wealthy province, whose defenses had also been weakened by the absence of the main field army. On the Bithynian coast, Igor and the surviving leadership had to decide what the expedition had become. A direct approach to the capital had failed. Some boats and men had been lost, and the fleet had discovered a weapon it could not easily counter. Immediate withdrawal offered the safest chance to preserve what remained. It also meant returning from an immense and expensive campaign without the tribute, concessions, or plunder needed to justify it. Igor chose to continue. The Rus landed and turned against the countryside. The decision had a hard military logic. The first clash had denied access to Constantinople, but the army could still fight on land. The Byzantine field forces remained absent, and the Asian shore offered supplies after the long voyage. A fast, concentrated raid might collect enough wealth to justify the expedition, then withdraw before imperial reinforcements arrived. The danger lay in how long success ashore would tempt the invaders to remain. Bithynia occupied the northwestern corner of Asia Minor, directly across the straits from Constantinople. Its coastal settlements, agricultural estates, monasteries, livestock, and stored provisions offered immediate rewards. Farther east lay Nicomedia, an important city near the head of the gulf that bears its name. The region was close to the capital, but not protected by the capital's great walls. The first attack supplied what the fleet needed. Food and animals could sustain the army. Captives and portable valuables could repay warriors who had survived the fire. Churches and monasteries held objects that could be carried away, while estates offered concentrated stores rather than the uncertain returns of searching scattered farms. As local resistance proved inadequate, the raiding zone expanded. Groups moved away from their landing points and pushed toward the interior and the Nicomedia region. Boats remained the expedition's only reliable route home, so some men had to guard them while others gathered plunder. Every successful raid encouraged the attackers to move farther from the coast. Nicomedia mattered because the routes toward it drew the raiders deeper into a wealthy and well-connected landscape. Roads that helped the Rus locate estates and move plunder could later carry Byzantine troops against them. Hills, wooded ground, and cultivated valleys broke the invading force into separate bodies. A group might dominate the settlement directly in front of it, while knowing little about what was happening several miles away. There was no communication system capable of recalling every detachment at once when the strategic situation changed. The army also had to decide what to do with what it seized. Food could be consumed, animals driven toward the coast, and small valuables divided. Heavier objects required transport. Captives could be sold or exchanged, but they slowed movement and consumed provisions. The success of each raiding group gradually reduced the speed with which it could respond to an unexpected Byzantine attack. Byzantine accounts describe terrible violence. They accuse the Rus of killing captives, crucifying prisoners, driving nails into victims, using people as archery targets, and destroying sacred buildings. Murder, enslavement, and devastation clearly accompanied the raids, although the most graphic details come from hostile literary sources and cannot be independently verified. The suffering was real. Some of the precise horrors attributed to the pagan attackers may also reflect the purpose and prejudices of the men who recorded them. For the people of Bithynia, the distinction offered little comfort. The weapon that had protected Constantinople could not defend every village or monastery. Theophanes' ships operated along the water, while the Rus spread across the land. Until imperial troops returned, the province paid the price for the time Romanos needed. The Rus were again succeeding, but their success introduced a new weakness. A concentrated army could defend itself. Hundreds of raiding parties scattered in search of food, captives, and valuables could be attacked separately. Loot slowed men who had arrived with little more than weapons and supplies. Captives required guards. Every movement inland increased the distance between a raiding group and its boats. Romanos did not need to destroy the invaders immediately. He needed to keep them from forcing a political collapse while orders went out across the empire. The operational fleet was recalled. Commanders were directed toward the threatened area. John Kourkouas received word to leave the eastern frontier and bring back forces capable of ending the invasion. Before Kourkouas could arrive, another experienced commander moved against the Rus. Bardas Phocas the Elder belonged to one of the great military families of Asia Minor. The surviving accounts do not preserve a detailed order of battle or a single clearly described confrontation. What they reveal instead is a campaign of containment and repeated attacks. Phocas gathered whatever troops were available and approached the raided districts. He did not need to seek one spectacular battle against the entire Rus force. His advantage lay in mobility, particularly if he possessed cavalry operating against men scattered across the countryside. A Rus force concentrated behind shields could be extremely dangerous in close combat. Spears, axes, and swords made an assault on an organized body of infantry costly. But men carrying plunder, driving animals, or guarding captives could not form a coherent defense as quickly. Byzantine horsemen could move along roads, identify isolated parties, strike them, and withdraw before larger groups assembled. Phocas began narrowing the invaders' freedom. Raiding parties that had moved without serious opposition now required scouts and escorts. Some were caught before reaching the coast. Others had to abandon targets or reduce the distance they traveled inland. The Rus could still plunder, but each expedition away from the boats carried greater risk. The purpose of these attacks was larger than the destruction of individual bands. Phocas was changing the calculation behind every Rus movement. A chief who sent most of his men searching for food might return with full hands, or he might lose them to cavalry. A group that remained together was safer but gathered less. Guards left at the boats could not help men caught inland, while warriors sent inland could not defend the fleet if Byzantine ships appeared. Without winning a famous set-piece battle, Phocas forced Igor's army to divide its attention among problems it had previously faced, one at a time. Byzantine cavalry possessed another advantage. It could often choose whether contact continued. If a Rus group formed tightly and occupied difficult ground, horsemen did not have to charge directly into its shields. They could watch the route toward the coast, threaten stragglers, and wait until the infantry resumed moving. The Rus remained dangerous whenever they achieved concentration. Phocas's task was to deny them the time and information required to concentrate in the right place. The decision to continue after the fire attack had produced immediate wealth. It had also given the empire time. While Igor's men searched Bithynia, the strategic conditions that had made the invasion possible were disappearing. John Kourkouas was returning. Kourkouas had served for years as domestic of the schools, effectively the senior commander of the Byzantine field armies. His campaigns against Muslim powers on the eastern frontier helped reverse a military balance that had challenged the empire for centuries. His soldiers were accustomed to mobile operations, long marches, raids, sieges, and fighting far from the capital. The Rus attack had succeeded in part because these men were absent. Their return changed the problem from one of raiding undefended settlements to surviving between imperial forces on land and a recovering navy at sea. Kourkouas did not need to offer Igor a formal battle on terms favorable to Rus infantry. He joined the pressure already being applied by Phocas. Dispersed groups were attacked, routes restricted, and the area in which the invaders could operate began contracting. Men who had pushed inland now had to return toward the coast before imperial forces cut them off from the fleet. The direction of the campaign now reversed. the Rus stopped expanding and began contracting. Plunder carried inland started moving back toward the water. Groups once separated by choice had to find one another under pressure. The arrival of the field army had changed the leadership's priorities. The campaign was no longer about how much could be taken. It was about whether the expedition could leave. Corcuas and Phocas did not have to seal every beach. They needed to make the Rus use a smaller number of viable embarkation points and to prevent an orderly departure. Each attack on a returning column delayed loading. Each threat along a road forced Igor to assign more men to protection. Time, which the raids had once converted into wealth, was now being converted into Byzantine strength. The chronology of individual encounters is poorly preserved, but the larger movement is clear. The Rus had arrived with the freedom to choose their targets. By late summer, Byzantine commanders were increasingly deciding where they could go. Igor now faced the reverse of the choice he had made after the first naval defeat. Remaining in Bithynia might gather more plunder, but it risked losing men faster than the fleet could replace them. The empire's main forces had returned, local resistance was strengthening, and the campaigning season was advancing. Withdrawal was no longer merely prudent, it was necessary. Orders or signals went out to recall the dispersed parties. Warriors who had been searching for new targets turned back toward their landing places. The movement created its own dangers. Groups had to cross territory, now watched by Byzantine cavalry. Loot and captives slowed them. Wounded men required assistance and space aboard ships already reduced by the fighting. The fleet awaiting them was not the same force that had crossed the Black Sea. Some vessels had burned or sunk. Others had suffered damaged rigging, scorched hulls, broken oars, or losses among their crews. Boats still usable for the return journey now had to carry additional goods, captives and survivors from destroyed craft. Plunder, the reward that had justified remaining in Bithynia, became a burden. Every object loaded aboard reduced room for food and men. Every captive required control. Heavily laden boats would maneuver less easily if the Byzantine fleet appeared again. The Rus also carried knowledge they had not possessed at the start of the campaign. They now understood what the fire ships could do, but recognizing the danger did not provide a reliable defense against it. They still had to pass through waters the Byzantines knew and controlled. Theophanes had not disappeared after the opening encounter. As imperial naval forces returned, the balance at sea shifted more decisively than it had on land. In June, the Byzantines had needed a specialized emergency squadron to stop a vastly larger fleet. By the time the Rus prepared to leave, the empire could attack with greater strength against an enemy already weakened by months of fighting. The exact location and formation of the final interception are uncertain. Some accounts suggest that the Rus shifted their operations toward the European shore, or Thrace, before attempting to depart. Others summarize the action without enough geographical detail to reconstruct every movement. What can be established is that the Byzantine navy under Theophanes attacked the Rus again during the withdrawal. This time, the Rus did not mistake the imperial ships for harmless prizes. The men aboard the leading boats knew that closing too tightly invited fire. Their alternatives, however, were limited. Dispersing gave Byzantine ships opportunities to isolate small groups. Remaining together offered mutual support, but recreated the congestion that had proved disastrous near the Bosporus. Theophanes chose to attack rather than simply allow the invaders to leave. The Byzantine objective had changed. In the first encounter, stopping access to Constantinople was enough. Now the empire had an opportunity to punish the force that had devastated Bithynia and prevent it from returning north with its army and plunder intact. As the imperial ships advanced, some Rus boats attempted to turn away. Others remained close for protection or because there was no clear route through neighboring vessels. The crews had to row, steer, defend themselves, and avoid burning ships, all while carrying loads accumulated during the campaign. Greek fire struck again. Conventional missiles and boarding attacks likely accompanied the incendiary assault, although the sources do not provide a complete tactical inventory. Once a boat caught fire or lost control, it threatened more than its own crew. It obstructed vessels behind it and forced others to turn across crowded water. The second encounter differed from the first in one decisive respect. Near Constantinople, the Rus had advanced voluntarily into close range because they believed the Byzantine ships could be captured. During the withdrawal, geography and necessity narrowed their freedom. They had to escape toward the Black Sea, preserve enough boats for the river journey, and keep crews together. Theophanes could threaten the route they needed, rather than wait for them to offer battle. Knowledge of Greek fire may even have complicated the Rus response. Boats keeping a wider distance from one another were harder to burn in groups, but easier for larger Byzantine vessels to isolate. Boats remaining close could support one another against boarding, yet a single burning craft might spread confusion through the cluster. There was no solution that removed every Byzantine advantage. The earlier defeat now influenced how the Rus reacted before the first new stream of fire reached them. Some men may have thrown loot overboard to lighten their boats. Others abandoned disabled vessels and climbed into craft that were already carrying full crews. Each rescued survivor reduced the speed and stability of the boat that received him. The effort to preserve men could make escape less likely. Byzantine accounts portray the destruction as nearly complete. Such claims are probably rhetorical, especially because Igor's political and military power did not disappear after 941. But the scale of the defeat was unquestionably severe. Numerous vessels were burned, sunk, captured, or abandoned. Many men died in the water or fighting aboard ships. Others were taken prisoner. Those captives faced little mercy. Byzantine sources report that prisoners brought to Constantinople were executed, apparently by beheading. Their deaths turned the imperial victory into a public act of punishment for the devastation inflicted across Bithynia. No reliable casualty list survives for either side. Later claims of nearly total Rus destruction cannot be reconciled with Igor's rapid return to military action, but rejecting those claims does not make the losses small. An expedition could remain politically capable while losing thousands of men, especially if much of Igor's military strength had never left the Rus territories. The surviving evidence points to catastrophic losses without literal annihilation. Byzantine losses are even harder to measure. The sources celebrate the defense of the capital and the destruction of the invaders, not the full number of soldiers and civilians killed across the province. Estates had been stripped, settlements damaged, captives removed, and religious communities attacked. The empire won without recovering many of the people and resources already lost. Its victory prevented a greater disaster. It did not undo the one Bithynia had endured. Igor, or at least the principal Rus leadership, escaped. The sources do not reveal exactly how many boats returned. Byzantine claims that only a handful survived belong to a victorious tradition and are probably exaggerated. Enough men and vessels remained to carry news of the disaster north, but the expedition that had approached Constantinople, expecting wealth and concessions, returned with its force greatly reduced. The journey home offered no easy release. The survivors still had to cross the Black Sea, enter the Dnieper, and confront the same rapids and portages they had passed while the fleet was strong. Now crews were fewer, boats were damaged, and the possibility of attack along the steppe frontier remained. The sources preserve no reliable details of storms, ambushes, or additional losses during the return. What is known is harsh enough. The campaign had failed in every major strategic objective. Constantinople remained secure. No favorable settlement had been forced in 941. The Rus had inflicted enormous suffering and carried away some plunder, but at a cost that likely outweighed their gains. Romanos had survived the moment when his capital was most exposed, while Theophanes, Phocas, and Corcuus had turned time into a weapon. Greek fire had created the first reversal, but it was only one part of the victory. The walls denied the Rus an easy, decisive target. The emergency squadron drove them away from the Bosporus. Phocas restricted their movement ashore. Corcuus returned before they could withdraw safely. The restored navy then struck at the point when damaged boats, reduced crews, loot, and captives made escape most difficult. Igor's most damaging mistake was therefore not simply approaching the fire ships. That decision cost vessels and men, but much of his army survived. The choice that transformed a setback into catastrophe was remaining in Byzantine territory after the first attack failed. Plundering Bithynia rewarded the survivors, but it surrendered the one advantage they could never recover: time. The apparent completeness of the Byzantine victory soon proved misleading. Igor had survived, and the political pressures behind the expedition remained. His warriors still expected wealth. Rus merchants still sought access to Byzantine markets. A ruler who accepted a humiliating defeat without response risked weakening his authority at home. Within approximately 3 years, Igor prepared to return. The Russian Primary Chronicle describes another great mobilization in 944. Its account includes Rus, Varangians, Slavic forces, and Pecheneg allies. Later tradition presents this coalition as larger than the force of 941, but no dependable total survives. What matters is that the previous disaster had not destroyed the Rus' capacity for war. The second mobilization revealed the limit of the first Byzantine victory. Igor had failed to reach Constantinople, but the routes, tributary networks, and political relationships that created his fleet still existed. Romanos could defeat an army at sea and on land. He could not burn the system that built it. A durable settlement required influencing Igor's choices before another fleet entered imperial waters. The presence of the Pechenegs altered the threat. They were not merely additional warriors aboard boats. As steppe horsemen, they could operate away from the river and threaten regions the earlier expedition had reached less easily. Their cooperation also reduced the danger they normally posed to the Rus while the army passed through the lower Dnieper. Igor began moving south again. This time, the Byzantines received warning before the coalition reached Constantinople. Romanos now faced a different decision from the one imposed on him in 941. The empire was no longer caught with only a handful of ships between the enemy and the capital. It could prepare for battle. Yet military readiness did not make another campaign desirable. Even victory could mean months of raids, destroyed settlements, lost ships, diverted troops, and thousands of civilians exposed to violence. Byzantine forces were needed on other frontiers, where every army recalled to defend the Bosporus created opportunities for another enemy. Romanos changed weapons. Instead of waiting to meet Igor with fire and cavalry, he sent envoys. They offered gifts, payments, and negotiation. To a modern observer, paying an advancing enemy after defeating him might resemble surrender. In Byzantine strategy, money was another means of preserving imperial strength. If a payment cost less than a campaign and redirected the Rus into a controlled relationship, it could accomplish more than a second battlefield victory. The Primary Chronicle describes Igor consulting his leading men near the Danube. It gives them a practical argument. If the Byzantines were offering wealth without battle, why risk another encounter with the fire that had destroyed them before? The conversation was recorded generations later, and cannot be accepted word for word, but the decision is credible. Igor took the offer and turned away before reaching Constantinople. The choice served both rulers. Igor could return with wealth and claim that renewed pressure had produced a result. Romanos avoided another invasion without weakening his armies in a costly battle. Yet payment alone could not prevent the cycle from beginning again. Both sides needed rules governing who could travel to Constantinople, under what conditions, and how peaceful merchants could be distinguished from raiders. Those rules appeared in the agreement usually called the Rus-Byzantine Treaty of 945, though it may have been concluded in 944 and ratified during the following year. The treaty did not simply reopen trade, it placed Rus access under closer supervision. Ships arriving from the north required written credentials issued in the prince's name. These documents identified the number of vessels and travelers, allowing Byzantine officials to distinguish authorized merchants from an unannounced armed force. Ships without proper certification could be detained. Rus visitors entered Constantinople through a designated gate, in regulated groups, and without weapons. Imperial officials monitored their activity. Other provisions governed shipwrecks, fugitives, captives, crimes, and disputes. Restrictions applied to Rus conduct near Cherson in Crimea and around the mouth of the Dnieper, areas where commercial routes and imperial security overlapped. The arrangement was less favorable to the Rus than the agreement traditionally associated with Oleg. Igor had demonstrated that he could still mobilize a dangerous coalition, but 941 had also shown the cost of attempting to force entry into the Byzantine system. He gained continued access and compensation. Byzantium gained greater control over the conditions of that access. The names preserved in the treaty reveal the society behind the expedition more clearly than any simple label can. Many envoys, agents, and merchants carried names of Scandinavian origin. Others had Slavic names. Some participants swore by pagan gods, while others invoked the Christian god. The Rus elite remained connected to the Viking world, but it was already becoming part of a broader and more complex political culture centered on the river routes of Eastern Europe. The settlement did not erase the violence of 941. Communities in Bithynia had been devastated, captives carried away, and prisoners executed. The Rus had lost men and ships in numbers that cannot be recovered from the surviving sources. No major territory changed hands, but the legal and political relationship between the two powers had been altered. Igor did not live long enough to direct that relationship for many more years. The primary chronicle places his death among the Drevlians in 945. According to its account, he collected tribute from them, departed, and then returned to demand more. The Drevlians resisted and killed him. It would be too simple to say that the defeat in Byzantium directly caused Igor's death. The sources do not establish such a chain. Yet the episode exposes the pressure underlying Rus rule. A prince depended on tribute and on his ability to satisfy an armed following. Expeditions could produce enormous rewards, but failed campaigns consumed ships, supplies, and men. The demand for wealth that helped carry Igor to Constantinople also shaped the final crisis of his reign. His death did not end contact with Byzantium. His widow Olga later embraced Christianity and traveled to Constantinople, though the date, place, and circumstances of her conversion remain debated. Their son Sviatoslav would fight a much larger war against the empire in the Balkans. Their grandson Vladimir eventually adopted Byzantine Christianity in 988, binding the Rus world to Constantinople in a way no raid had achieved. The campaign of 941 did not directly cause that conversion, nor did it create the later Varangian Guard. The connection is more gradual. Warfare, trade, Diplomacy and military service drew the Rus and Byzantines into repeated contact. Warriors from the north, who once approached the city as attackers, would later serve Byzantine emperors. The empire that had burned Rus boats also offered markets, titles, silver, religion, and political legitimacy. Constantine VII's writings reveal how seriously Byzantium continued to view the northern power. Imperial policy studied the Rus route, the construction of their boats, the locations of the Dnieper rapids, and the pressure that Pecheneg attacks could apply at those vulnerable portages. Constantinople's defense did not depend only on walls or secret weapons. It depended on knowing how an enemy traveled, where he needed allies, and where diplomacy could make his journey more dangerous. That was the larger enemy the Rus encountered in 941. At the opening of the campaign, they had judged the visible balance correctly. The Byzantine fleet was away. The strongest field army was absent. Only a small squadron stood between them and the richest city they knew. Their mistake was assuming that the empire's weakness at one moment defined the limits of what it could become. Romanos turned old ships into incendiary platforms. Theophanes struck after the Rus' numerical advantage crowded their boats together. When a substantial Rus force landed, the Byzantines did not mistake the first victory for the end of the invasion. Bardas Phocas attacked the raiders where they were dispersed. John Kourkouas returned before they could leave. The navy struck again when their vessels were damaged and burdened with the spoils they had remained to collect. Greek fire became the unforgettable image of the campaign because it transformed the sea into a place of panic and death. But the fire worked as part of something larger, an imperial system capable of surviving surprise, delaying defeat, recalling strength from distant fronts, and changing from military resistance to diplomacy when negotiation became more useful than battle. The Rus had crossed rivers, carried boats around rapids, passed hostile steppe territory, and sailed the Black Sea. They had reached Constantinople at the moment of their greatest advantage. What stopped them was not fear in the ordinary sense, and it was not a single miraculous flame. It was an empire that could change the nature of the war faster than its invaders could escape it. In 941, fire on the Bosporus denied the Rus their prize. The campaign that followed taught both powers a more enduring lesson. Neither could remove the other from the routes connecting their worlds. They would fight again, trade again, negotiate again, and eventually transform one another.